This is Generous Theology. In this episode, Chuck and Brock contemplate Chapter 51, Faith and Reason, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
And what's interesting to me is then what I think we see in Damien and Anselm, and even though they come across very differently, at least in some ways, is you see people who now, after nearly a millennium, not quite, of this kind of thought being the air that's breathed, but also now nearly a millennium since Paul has written and hundreds of years since Augustine has written, contradicting some of those thoughts. And what I think is Damien and Anselm struggling with that. And in both cases, really wanting to stick with the Paul's narrative in the epistles, with Augustine's sort of discussion of these matters, and with scriptural revelation on these kinds of things as a way of thinking about how do we think about then faith and reason? How do we think about the world? And it's interesting to me that, yeah, there is a little bit of a difference. You quoted Mann talking about how Damien is willing to find a place for reason in the servants' quarters, but he also says Anselm welcomes reason into the salon. He's seemingly boundlessly optimistic about the powers of reason to achieve understandings about the content of faith, and speaks very much about rational arguments for dealing with things. He provides arguments for the rational necessity of God's existence, of God's attributes, the fact that God is the creator, the fact that he was incarnated, even the idea of the Trinity. And what I find really interesting about that is that in both of these cases, while there is some difference in emphasis between Damien and Anselm, what both of them have been able to do is point out that while faith has certainly a key role in how we think about things, and in fact, Anselm as well puts a great deal of importance to the primacy of faith, they still understand that reason is a God-given tool, and it is a part of who we are, and therefore we can use reason as a way to deal with the things in which we have faith, the revealed teachings of Scripture, that we can still use our rationality to think through all those things. And so I just found, especially that section on Anselm, to be really, even though it's very early in the Middle Ages, there's a lot, I think, from these early Middle Ages thinkers that we ought to be going back to. And there's a sense, I think I may have said this last week or the week before even, Anselm just keeps coming up. And I've got Anselm now is on my list of people that I really feel like I need to do some more reading on him, just because it really is he's thought deeply about these things, and he's thought in very sophisticated kind of ways, but in sophisticated kind of ways that still understand the primacy of faith and reason as a tool. And perhaps in today's day and age, we've moved away from some of that. We've turned reason into the primary way that we think about the world, and we forget about reason. So that's my reaction to Damien, Anselm, and these 11th century Christian thinkers.
Thank you, Chuck. I really appreciated that. Let me read a couple of sentences from the professor's section here. And this is regarding Anselm, who you were just talking about. And then we'll look more into the high Middle Ages portion. But first, just a couple of passages here relating to Anselm. Firstly, the professor says this: at the same time, Anselm insists that faith precedes understanding. That is, he, meaning the student of the scriptures, would not understand these propositions unless he believed them. Now, you and I have talked before about this concept of biblical scholarship being directly related to two separate streams of thought. And that is to say, there's a difference in theology when believers in Christ are doing the theological reasoning versus when, let's say, folks who are not believers at the typical University of Vienna style humanities academy does theology. And so we really see these two different schools of thought. I almost want to throw out two different religions, or at least ask about that. Think, for example, of the scholarship of academics like Bart Ehrman, who's not a believer, and the conclusions that he comes to regarding the Christian religion from a contemporary who he debates with, who he interacts with, who's also a serious scholar, quote unquote. And there's really something there. And it perhaps boils down to this nugget that Anselm has insisted upon, that faith precedes understanding. Now, when you survey the landscape and you try to work this through, how does it strike you?
Yeah. So, first of all, that idea of faith preceding understanding, I just, as I read that insistence from Anselm, to me, it just rang so true with my Christian education background. The idea that it was, and I remember having some discussions with friends of mine who were struggling with the idea, should they have their kids in Christian schools, given the cost and all those kinds of things. And there would be some who would say, I think maybe I'll, start them in public school and switch them over later. And others would say, no, I think I'll just go K-6 in Christian schools and we'll go to public school later. And this idea that faith precedes understanding is just such a strong argument as to why I think faith-based education is so important, because it begins at the very beginning. Even in preschool, you're developing faith, and that faith needs to precede understanding. And so, even what you're doing with 3 and 4 year olds in school, or even 2 year olds and 1 year olds at church with the children's church types of things that happen, is we are building and encouraging a faith that precedes understanding. But that continues through that entire education. And so, even at the college level, and the university level, where you're really getting deep into understanding, there's a sense in which there still is a role, and not just a sense, there clearly is a deep role for Christian formation as part of that. Because again, faith precedes understanding. And actually, at my daughter's college graduation on Friday, Walker Cosgrove, who is a history professor at the university she attended, gave the commencement address, and that was his whole concept as well, is that faith precedes understanding, and that what we understand and what we study all comes in the light of our faith. And to today, thinking about those who, as you describe, is in the more University of Vienna academic institutions, I think there has been, when we forget the idea or when we deny the idea that faith precedes understanding, we do two things. One is we cut off the importance of faith, and we endanger our own people who are studying if we separate faith and understanding faith and reason and consider them as being just completely separate and not relatable at all with each other. We really, in many ways, have a negative impact even on the understanding of those who are studying, because their faith won't be the faith that we believe to be the truth. But second of all, is that even if we deny that faith precedes understanding, it is simply a fact that faith precedes understanding. And even for those whose faith is different, even for those whose faith suggests that there is no such thing as faith, all there is rationality, that in and itself is faith. That in and of itself is a faith proposition that colors the understanding of the learner. And therefore, that is, in that case, the faith that precedes understanding. Now, it's not a true faith. It's a faith that we would say is flawed and false, but yet it is still their faith. It is the faith that precedes understanding for those people as well. And it just really ties into the importance of, even at the pedagogical level, thinking about how do we teach? How do we impart understanding? Part of that must be understanding and acknowledging that faith precedes understanding. And so that there is a role for faith, there's a role for imparting that faith, there is a role for applying that faith in all of the academic pursuits in which we take part. So I just loved that section, and there's so much more that Anselm talks about here. That he talks about how folks who try to employ their faculty of understanding in the investigation of religious matters without having first an adequate grounding in faith, and he says such people are like bats and owls who only see the heavens at night and dispute with eagles about the midday sun. They're missing out on something. There's something that they're not seeing. And beyond that, without faith, they're unable to interpret experience in the way that the person of faith is able. And so they'll fail to understand the higher religious truths that are conveyed by that interpretation. They'll fail to understand how they're learning, they're studying the science that they're doing, the reason that they're partaking in. They'll miss the higher truths that have come as part of that. And then because they lack sufficient faith, the deliverances of their understanding are apt to be unstable, resulting in the subversion of what faith they might have had. And we see that as well. If we're not careful in understanding that faith precedes understanding, and we cut people off and we just say, okay, faith, that's for Sunday, your rationality, that's for the rest of the week, suddenly you're subverting the faith that they've had. And suddenly that Sunday faith becomes a no-day faith because their understandings become completely unstable. So there was just so much here from Anselm that I just found so helpful and so useful in thinking about.
That's so beautiful, Chuck. I think we have to put some Anselmian reading material on our reading queue. There's more here, and this is a very important thinker. Now, I was hoping to get to the High Middle Ages, but there's something here that's so famous and so relevant that I feel like it has to be said with relation to Anselm. And that's this idea, this famous argument of Anselm's, where Anselm believes that God's existence is demonstrated with respect to the notion of that which nothing greater can be conceived. And I'm convinced, of course, I'm not a heavyweight in philosophy, but I think that even the most sophisticated philosophical mind has to admit that there's something to chew on here. And I'm not asking for us to necessarily chew on it. It's a very highly technical subject, and it's a difficult one for many people. But having said that, while Anselm says that faith is necessary for a proper understanding, he still regards that there are truths such as God's existence and God's attributes that are demonstrable just as necessary truth, independent of the faith faculty. And so we start to get into these ideas, and then we start thinking about what about the incarnation? If God's existence is a demonstrably necessary truth, is the incarnation a contingent act? And does it matter? And what can we say about this? Now, in trying to answer that, we have to point out that the question is not asked in the sense of following the biblical testimony. This is an extra biblical issue to explore. And we see how that's become very popular in the culture today. When Christians go to the marketplace of ideas, most non-Christians find it, quote unquote, unacceptable that Christians would bring a Bible to what they might say is a science discussion. And so that's changed. That's the dynamic has changed since this Anselmian time. And yet, folks who want to make this purely a matter of science are overlooking the fact that we're really in the waters of metaphysics as opposed to being in the pool of science or demonstration. And that's a really important thing, because depending upon how you look at this, you and I might be liable to make quote unquote religious knowledge a secondary form of knowledge, if it's even knowledge at all in the secular sense, in the modern humanistic sense that comes from. Now, you and I, of course, hold different positions. And I would hold that religious knowledge is, in fact, primary or more important than demonstrated knowledge, because demonstrated knowledge builds with the Legos or building blocks of metaphysics, which will include presuppositions that are accepted by faith. And this is not just a Christian task. This is what everybody does when they swim in the ocean of metaphysics. And so Anselm's a very important figure here. When you're talking with somebody who wants to take this hard Enlightenment, this defining the bounds of acceptable discourse with respect to an Overton window of methodological naturalism, which is the idea that only that which is measurable and material and can be demonstrated exists. How do you talk to somebody like that who has such a negative view? So we talked in the beginning about Damien putting reason in the servants' quarters, and of course, faith is the queen of the house. And now in the Enlightenment and the post-Enlightenment period and into modernity, it's faith that's in the doghouse. And so, how would you respond in that kind of situation? And if somebody wanted to pull back the provenance to Anselm here, how would you talk with them about this?